really pleased to welcome, well, I don't know if I should say welcome, but introduce, maybe not even introduce, because I think Berkay is familiar to most people in the room. My name is Robtel, Pailey. I'm an assistant professor in the department, and I'm co-chairing this year's departmental seminar series. Today's presentation is by Professor Berkay, of course, of the London School of Economics. At the moment, he's in Abu Dhabi as a member of a visiting faculty member. Today's presentation is going to be titled "The Concentration of Children on Income Distribution and Its Consequences for Poverty and Inequality." And for people who are not familiar with Berkay and his work, he is professor of social and public policy, as well as co-director of the Women in Social and Public Policy Research Hub at the LSE. He previously worked at Yale University and held visiting positions at Princeton, Essex, University College London, and Oxford. And he's frequently posted in newspapers across the globe, particularly for his work that sits at the intersection of demography, sociology, and economics, and has appeared in a number of different prominent journals as well as news media across the globe. So without much ado, we'll have Professor Berkay Ozcan present on the concentration of children on income distribution and its consequences for poverty and inequality. Welcome back.
Thank you so much, Robtel, for the introduction, and it's so wonderful to see everyone. I wished I could be there in person. My visa complications just resolved on Friday, so couldn't really join you. The intention was to be there in person and to see the new walls of the meeting room and the decoration and the department, which I hadn't seen. So it all looks very flashy and nice from this distance. This is a paper that I haven't worked over the last 10 months at all. So when I downloaded from the overleaf, it gives a new date, October 17, 2024, which is very nice because every time you do it, it adds the date, but it hasn't been changed at all. So I made this disclaimer because I presented this work 10 months ago at the demography group, and Shuang has watched this work. So I apologize from her that this will be the second time to see this work, and we haven't got the chance to improve it much.
You should have told her earlier.
So we were more optimistic about improving some of the things, and I actually started presenting this work by saying that we are looking at the children's distribution over income by using a tool that no one has ever did, and it's a concentration indices. As of yesterday, I saw a paper came out in Population Development Review doing something very similar using these indices, although much different than our work. And it was just online first as of yesterday. So I said, like, okay, so this is a good time for me to present this work, get the feedback, and finish the work. And I really appreciate your colleagues, any type of feedback that you may have on this paper. So without further ado, I'll just start. This is a joint work with Rafael Carranza. Some of you may remember him, and he was a former PhD student in our department, supervised by myself and Stephen Jenkins. And he graduated, became a postdoctoral scholar at Oxford University. And after 3 years there, he was also an affiliated research fellow at the Inequality Institute at the LSE. And he recently became an assistant professor at University of Chile and at the School of Government. And this is a joint work with him. So what we do is, sorry, I'm unable to move screen. Okay. What we do is we revisit a very old question that demographers have asked for a long time, whether income and fertility has any relationship with it, whether rich people have more children than poor people. The question is as old as the famous writings of Malthus, goes to almost 18th century, and economists have been discussing this within the context of if children are normal good, more money means that people will be consuming more of that normal good. That means they will have more of the children. However, when you look at the empirical work over the years, nowadays the empirical studies show a negative correlation between income and fertility, both within countries and between countries. And this was much of the discussions among the demographers about the demographic transition, why this correlation is negative if the children are costly and they're normal good, and when rich people should have more of those children than poor people do. We revisit this question. And the negative relationship between income and fertility is documented across the cohorts by other people too. There was this lit review paper by Jones and Turtles, and which is reproduced by Matthias Dobke, which is an LSE professor in the econ department, in a recent handbook of economics of family last year, shows that actually the negative correlation is quite visible at the early part part of the 18th century up until the mid-19th century cohorts. And this negative correlation is more visible among the mid-income groups, but as long as the richer income groups, the correlation becomes flatter and flatter over time. So there's currently, among the cohorts that are born in more recent years, there's a dearth of evidence showing that whether the income and fertility are correlated. And the theoretical sign of positive correlation is quite elusive. And Becker has written many theoretical arguments or papers about why there should be a not existing a positive correlation. One of the theory talks about quantity versus quality trade-off. He argues that as people become richer, their preferences about quality child goes up, so they kind of give up on the quantity. And there are some other theories from sociological studies that shows husband and wife earnings differentials as they come closer and women and men's life courses become similar, then the fertility preferences change. And the arguments about human capital accumulation, the investment on children becoming more prominent over the cohorts. When people want to invest more on the children, the correlation goes on the other direction as well. So there are many theoretical reasons why the positive correlation may not be observed, even though it's the starting point of the Malthusian questions. However, positive correlation was actually observed in particular conditions. If you read the economic history literature, historians have found in certain contexts positive correlation observed very clearly. For example, on the very low part of the HDI distribution, the countries on the very lowest income and human development index context, a positive correlation between income and fertility has been observed. And also in older data sets in economic historians looked at in Europe, such as France in 19th century and Slovakia in 19th century, so have found evidence that there was some positive correlation where rich people had more children than poor people did. So there is also large literature on some positive causal effect of income on individuals' fertility that looked at the microdata. So these are kind of things that if people won lottery, they have more kids. Or if there's an exogenous shock of income, their salaries have gone up dramatically by an exogenous source of income, that they started planning to have more kids. And there's some small literature that did these positive causal effect papers, and the findings are a bit mixed on that microdata. In some contexts, they found the positive effect, others not. And the recent review book chapter in Matthias Dobke, our colleague at the LSE, argues that the negative correlation has also largely disappeared, but surprisingly, he couldn't find in his literature review any evidence of very solid positive correlation in the last 30, 40 years in any countries. So he says there's some suggestive evidence at the country level, but absolutely not within the country. So when you pick up a country, you don't see that correlation between income distribution, rich and poor differences. And the very few studies on income and fertility relationship have actually interested in this question in the last 15 years. I think the latest paper wanted to look at the correlation between income and fertility was from 2006, 2007. It was pre-Great Recession period. We entered almost all advanced economies since 2010, a low fertility trend across the world, which is unexplained by the fertility transition theories. At the moment, there's a lot more discussion about understanding why, despite all sorts of policies, the decline or very low, stable low fertility rates have been not changing their trends. In Norway, in Scandinavia, and a lot of countries have implemented a lot of reforms, and despite the fact that their declining trends hasn't halted. So these income and fertility relationship, when it's revisited, very few single country studies trying to understand the correlation and haven't come up with any plausible argument about the last 15 years. So here's a graph from the Dobke's book, and shows in 1980s, there were some negative slope between GDP per capita across the countries and the fertility rates. And that negative slope 20 years later have turned somewhat positive across the countries. But nowadays, there's no replication of the study. And then they show that almost that is flattened line. So what we do, given this context, that we don't know what is happening between income and fertility, first we ask, where are the children in the household income distribution? Are they more likely to be born in the rich households, poor households, or middle income households? And we propose a tool that is being used in income distribution analysis quite commonly, which is called concentration indices, to look into both childlessness and the higher parity. And we show that the children are increasingly concentrated in the income distribution's upper parts. And we compare a large set of OECD countries over time. And then we talk a bit about what is the implication of having more and more children concentrated in the upper part of the income distribution in countries for estimating inequality, poverty, or child poverty. And we use some of the new novel methods called rift regressions, and I'm not going to go much into detail of these analyses and technicality. I should say that the recent literature has been interested in the childlessness as well. There's a lot of focus on who's not having children as opposed to what we are focusing here, who's having children. And that's a different focus than who's having children, because when people are investigating, and there are a few studies out there already, like the income gradient of who's not having children, the part of the distribution where who's having many children is often ignored. So we want to look at both who's not having children as zeros, as well as who's also having many children, not only a binary have children or not. So we contribute to the two strands of literature in this setting. And one of the literature that is this old literature that we talk about fertility differentials and how they relate to inequality and poverty and economic growth. And this literature has often looked at fertility differentials by education. What was focused in this literature is among the educated women and uneducated women, among the educated man, uneducated man, if the women's data is missing. For over 30, 40 years, look at the fertility differentials between these two types of educational differences. And there's a dynamics focus throughout the transition periods between the increasing education and decreasing fertility rate of women. And they looked at, and there are some papers came out in 2016 and 2020 that talks about the Kuznets curves of fertility over demographic transitions. It's almost always the discussions on education rather than income. Nowadays, we live in a society, in most advanced societies, the education is quite widespread and becoming less and less differentiating factor in terms of fertility, especially at a time where the fertility differentials have collapsed. And then there's separate literature that looks at the role of family structure changes and that we observe over the 30, 40 years almost in all advanced economies, and how that relates to inequality, because the argument behind that literature is family is the unit over which we look at the household incomes. And when we look at the household income distributions, if that unit is experiencing dramatic changes, such as increasing single-headed households, increasing divorce rates, reducing family sizes in terms of number of children, but also more cohabitation, delayed marriages, and so on. So they look at the holistic set of family structure changes. How does that account for increasing inequality when we are measuring these units as units? And there are notable exceptions, such as Bruce Western and Deirdre Bloom and Perchesky paper in 2008 that look at only the families with children, families without the children, but majority of the focus were on single mothers and single mothers versus dual income parents. And all of these literature do what we do here, quite descriptive decomposition papers. So what they do is they look at the income distribution in the country. They say, can we decompose how much of these income distribution actually comes from families with children? How much of them are contributed by families without children or single mothers or different types of households? So it's kind of decomposing the variances across these different family types. So from this point onwards, I will talk a bit about data and some findings and contributions, and I will introduce the tool, and then we'll talk a bit more about what are the implications for poverty and inequality. So we started with the Luxembourg Income Studies data, which is now based in the III of the LSE. And that is a cross-sectional data that is predominantly collected to standardize income measures across the countries over quite a few decades now. And it starts from 1990, but not every country starts from 1990. So we kind of call it around 1990. Some countries have the data from late 80s, some early 90s. And there are some data, countries that have proliferated in the inclusion in Luxembourg Income Studies in 2020s. And we look at the interval between 2015 to 2020, and we look at the over 30 years periods. is there a concentration of children across the income distributions over a large set of countries to basically show the stylized facts about what's happening globally. Not globally, sorry, among the high-income countries, because we look at the 24 high-income countries that are covered by the Luxembourg Income Studies. So we wanted to include a bunch of middle-income countries just for benchmark. I'll show the middle-income countries too. Unfortunately, in this study, we can't look at the low-income countries because we don't have comparable data sets across the low-income countries settings. So the final samples that we have focus on number of, like we consider children who are age 14 or younger. We don't consider the people who are 16 as children because across the countries, the labor laws and income earning laws vary. So 15 is an accepted cutoff where people cannot bring households income. And another thing that we wanted to focus on households with children, because children are often estimated in the income distribution analysis or poverty analysis as people who don't bring income, but they consume income from the household. Because they don't bring income to the household, in household inequality, income inequality, poverty analysis, often use tools such as equivalence scales, which are tools to adjust the needs of the households with children and make them similar to the needs of the households without children, and considering the fact that children don't bring income, but they do consume some part of the household incomes, and those needs may be different. And we look at these two periods, and we just show a bunch of stylized facts. So we use concentration indices, and we assess actually the position of children in income distribution using these tools, which are very similar to any summary statistics. Much of you might be familiar with the Gini coefficient. It has the very same, like similar logic to Gini coefficient. It just shows where the concentration is rather than inequality is. And the advantage of it is it's a bivariate measure. So when you look at the Gini of income, when we talk about in this government reports and in income inequality, we talk about Gini has gone up, Gini has gone down. It just gives statistics about one variable, which is income. Concentration index compares income as of to the number of children. So it's bivariate, and that's advantages for us. So it allows us to show the concentration of children once we rank the income distribution by income. And we use as the outcome measure total household factor income, which is a jargon, just to say that it's market income we are interested in. What does market income means? Before the welfare state enters in the game, taxes and transfers. So it's just whatever the market total income is. And then we can look at these things differently by looking at labor income, capital income, and pension income, and fringe benefits. But the total household income sums them up all, because what we are interested in is, before the welfare state's intervention to the households, when we assign people rich and poor, where are the children born, and then how much that redistribution actually changes the picture. So the basic notion, I'm not going to go much in the detail of the concentration index, is that if it's less than 0, it shows us concentration of children are more likely to happen in the bottom of the income distribution. If it's equal to 0, children are distributed equally at every percentile across the income distribution. If it's positive, concentration is more likely to be happening on the top of the income distribution. So then interpretation becomes very similar to Gini, because concentration curve, like indices, also are derived from the Lorenz curves. And income here just provides us some sort of ranking to decide who's poor, who's rich, who's middle, and so on. So this is a concentration curve for Taiwan. I thought it would be a nice illustration for explaining what we are trying to do here. And the dashed gray line here, I don't know if you see my mouse on the screen, vertical, like a straight dashed line on the 45-degree angle, shows if every children was born at every percentile in the equal chance. So the rich and poor and middle have the same amount of number of children, then it would be a straight line. The further away from the curve line, that means that there is more concentration. And unlike the Lorenz curve, the concentration curve can also go above the diagonal. And that shows that the children might be concentrated in the upper part of the distribution or the lower part of the distribution. Here I chose Taiwan because in 1986, the concentration was nearly zero. So the rich, middle, and the poor income people were having children or had children in their households at the equal probability. And by 2016, literally 30 years later, it became 0.28. It's an enormous increase in concentration, means that a lot of people on the poor bottom part of the income distribution are not having children anymore, or children are not present in those households anymore. I should actually clarify at some point, because we don't have the fertility data. We just have the data that within the household, are the children present or not? If any question comes around, like, are they adopted children? Are they stepchildren? We don't know that in this setting. We just know that in these households located on the bottom of the income distribution, we are seeing less and less children, and children are more likely to be present on the middle and the upper part of the income distribution. That's all we see. But that's a good illustration because enormous increase in concentration. And then when we look at the cross-country setting, what we see dramatically is on the x-axis concentration of children in 1990, about 30 years ago, and concentration of children in 2020 on the y-axis of the graph. Again, the dashed gray line shows if no change, the countries are staying exactly in the similar concentration levels. And the countries that are above the line, that shows that their concentration has increased. That means that the concentration has gone positively. That means that our children are more and more likely to happen on the upper parts of the income distribution rather than the lower part of the income distribution. Although there are some countries that have more children now in the lower part of the income distribution, overwhelmingly majority of the countries have moved to the upper direction. I wanted to show these Scandinavian countries on the very top corner, Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden. These countries, even in 1990, they have enormously high concentration index. That means that when you look at their income distribution, the households with children are likely to be on the very top, on the top upper parts of the income distribution. And they have gone, for some of them, such as Norway, even further up, or Finland, even further up. And remind you that this is over market income. So the welfare state hasn't intervened these countries yet. So in a way that after welfare state transfers and taxes, I don't know if I have this for the disposable income, it becomes even more dramatic. On the x-axis, the numbers have gone up between 0.4 to 0.6, which shows that these countries look even more unequal, or put differently, it's very narrative breaking, I guess, for Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway in Scandinavian countries. Put differently, in these countries, once you look at the welfare state contributions, the households with children, like the presence of children in the households, become even more exclusively rich. In another way, the welfare state is transferring more funding towards households with children in these countries than not from the rest of the distribution. And then there are some countries on the bottom. So almost there's, except Slovakia here is an exception, and Denmark and Sweden here, some change in the lower part. Almost every country, when you look at the welfare state transfers, they became where the children are more likely to be moving from the bottom part of the income distribution towards the higher part of the income distribution. It means that we are in an era where entire welfare states and majority of the advanced economies are geared towards transferring more funding towards the households with children. And the children are, despite the fact that they are more likely to be happening in the market income distribution, after the welfare state intervention, they are more likely to happen in richer households. So part of the people might be saying, okay, this is entirely driven by age, because we know that nowadays the fertility is delayed to mid-30s in most countries. If fertility is delayed to mid-30s rather than mid-20s, and in mid-30s, mostly people are on their primary, prime part of their wage distribution, they're more likely to earn better incomes. It must be age differences driving entire correlation in the countries. That's a very plausible theory. But what we do here is kind of throw a neutron bomb here. So we did, I have a slide that I can explain how we did the age adjustment, but we run the regressions by very flexible age coefficients and residualize the age. And then we control for the age and redid this plot by taking any possible age effect out of it. And the hunch is true. So majority of that concentration happens because of the age distribution changes. In other words, is that when people are starting having more and more children towards later part of their life courses, 30s and late 30s and closer to 40s, they're more likely to be richer. And in those households, they tend to be more likely to be on the top part of the income distribution rather than having an early part of the income distribution. But even when you take away all the age effect, when you control for old age, we still see the countries like Scandinavian countries, but also Netherlands, Taiwan, Belgium, and so on, have dramatically high concentration in 2020 compared to 1990. So even if when you take into account the age, when we see that richer households or the children are now more and more likely to be present in the rich households than poor households, and even before the taxes and transfers, and even after the taxes and transfers, they become even richer households. And I wanted to, we started discussing, this might have some implications for the poverty and inequality. But before moving that, we said, oh, maybe we are looking at two data points. One of them is 1990, the other one is 2020. What is happening in between might be a different fluctuation, and we are picking up two random points. Here, what we wanted to do is basically look at every year's concentration trends across the countries by looking at market income before the government intervention, disposable income, and age-adjusted income. We did it for the US because we had the most continuous series in the list data for the US, and we could do it for Denmark and Sweden as well with some gaps in the data. But it shows that there is an upward trend, even in the US, when you look at the concentration index on the market income before the taxes and transfers, and majority of it is driven by age. However, there is a flat and increased concentration of children, even in the US after 2000s, once you control for all of these factors, and that's quite stable continuing there. So there are some changes in the reversals happened throughout the 1990s in terms of poor people or people on the lower middle income groups not having as children anymore, or children are not present in those households anymore. And we looked at other countries, whether we could compare the similar trends. The graphs look a bit more messy, but you could see UK on the very bottom, and upward trends since the 2010s, dramatically, even we controlled for a bunch of age-related factors and other obvious confounders. And there's, the countries that have shown some decline throughout the 1970s have been either stabilized their decline or has started going up, such as Canada, for example, or Germany has been stabilized over time, and France has gone up. Many of the countries have started showing upward trends in the concentration of children across the rich households. So the consequence of these trends had multiple. One of them is a technical consequence. And I'm sure a couple of people in the audience might appreciate. I don't know if I can't see Tanya if she's there too, because I think she's recently published a super interesting article, which I read about the children and equivalent scales and updated work. One of the things that we discuss in the inequality groups a lot, the choice of equivalent scales. A lot of people have nowadays automatized choosing an equivalent scales when they're publishing government reports and official statistics. It is either OECD's modified scale or like the US official statistics use a 1/square root index. These are simple adjustment tools to adjust the needs for the households with children and without the children when they are looking at the disposable incomes so that an income inequality analysis could be done. And those debates were very lively in the 1990s. How do we adjust for having a child in the household? Or like Tanya's work with Ashgar Zaidi and about how do we adjust for having a disabled person in the household. Households have different needs of sorts. And those discussions have faded away a bit in the last 10, 15 years as my reading of the literature. And we thought that having this pattern where children are more likely to be present in the richer households should have some mechanic implications for these adjustments. And I'll talk about how those implications are. And then we say, if those mechanic implications are there, and on top of it, there will be direct implications on inequality and child poverty, we might be estimating inequality and poverty figures quite distorted way if we don't really seriously inspect these factors and the dynamic trends happening in the households. And then we can look at the relative importance of the household composition if I have time. So equivalence scales, this is a bit technical, but I wanted to walk you through quickly. These are like equivalence scale elasticities represent the power by which economic needs changes with the household size. And the very basic term that we use here is elasticity, which is the scale that is used, how it's adjusted by the household size. So the typical thing is you may say, I count every individual in the household as the same. So an income is divided by equally, whether that person is a child, a baby, or an adult. And there would be the elasticity 1, which what we use as a per capita income. And you may say that like, I don't count those children at all, and there's absolutely no equivalent scale, and then the elasticity will be 0. And these are two extreme assumptions about the household's needs when we are estimating poverty and inequality, whether we should take into account those people, children, as 0 versus 1. And most policy papers and official statistics actually use somewhere in between, which is OECD's scale, which varies by, so each adult is considered 1, and then the second and the third adult is considered with a declining coefficient. And the square root, which is used by the US and a bunch of Latin American countries in their official statistics of poverty and inequality. So we use these official statistics all the time. OECD scale elasticity depends on the household size composition, and it varies between 0.4 to 0.7, depending of the size of the households up to 5 people. And after 5 people, there's additional person doesn't really bring anything to the scale. So there are larger differences in inequality when we measure these things as concentration grows. This is a bit of a complicated graph, but I want to take a few minutes to look at this graph because I think this is the gist of what I wanted to say in this talk. On the bottom x-axis, we show the levels of concentration indices. The triangles and the circles are the countries, and triangles represent how the picture looked like in 1990, and the circle shows how the picture looks like in 2020. In the x-axis is the difference in estimating Gini of income inequality using total income or per capita income, these two extremes. In one scenario, when we calculate the inequality where children count 0. In other scenario, we calculate the Gini coefficient in the country where children count as any adult in terms of their consumption and the household construction. And when we calculate for the same inequality figure for the same country, by counting children as 0 and by counting children as adult, we take the difference and we put it on the y-axis, that difference. So this curve shows that actually the more children are concentrated on the x-axis, the more likely to we find dramatic differences in the choice of equivalence scales in our official estimates. Put differently, official estimates of inequality differs dramatically more as the children concentrates more in the country. So we are more likely to make arbitrary choices for countries such as Norway, Finland, and Denmark in terms of how much poverty and inequality is there than for countries such as for Spain. And this is one of the implications that I want to say, because we have been constantly thinking about these countries as the gold standard when it comes to welfare state inequality and so on. It doesn't change the fact that their overall inequality level is lower than the rest of the countries. But we tend to underestimate inequality in those countries more just because we choose arbitrary concentrate like equivalent scales. And these scales have some consequences today more so than it has been like in 1990s. That's why we were calling for a revisit of these studies and revisit and rethinking of these official statistics if we are biasing these countries where the children are highly concentrated on the top in the official statistics of poverty and inequality. So even when you take two equivalence scales that are very similar, such as OECD's equivalence scales, which is in every OECD publications of poverty and inequality, and the square root equivalence scale, which is considered in some of the Latin American countries' official statistics, as well as the official US poverty statistics. These are the tools for adjustment. Even when they're very close to each other, they are not as extreme as treating children as adults or treating children as zero. They're more in the middle. Even when you consider these middle indices and estimate the inequality in the same country using one versus the other, the differences grow as the concentration of children grows. The same pattern we see that positive slope here too. Even when you think that we are using a more inequitous equivalence scales, we are underestimating inequality for countries where the children are more likely to be born to the rich households. So concentration compresses the income distribution. And once we establish the fact that children are now more concentrated at the top of the income distribution, and we see that high-income families observe a larger equalization, and the distribution is more compressed on the top, and we give more benefit of the doubt to those countries. And equivalence scales with higher elasticities will automatically see a higher decrease in inequality. Per capita income inequality is lower than total income inequality for them. And comparing actually between OECD modified scales versus non-modified scales doesn't, like the picture becomes less clear for inequality. So now we know that equivalence scales become a more delicate tools to use for official statistics and poverty. I want to use them to show what happens to poverty and inequality across countries. So what are the consequences of this increasing trend of children being only present on the rich households or mostly present by the rich households? So the income inequality has been growing in most countries over the time period. So this is doing nothing, just as establishing stylized fact. Most countries shifted on the upper side of the curve in 2020s. So the trend in increase in inequality hasn't stopped. And so has child poverty too. And there is an increase in child poverty for most countries, although some countries have decreased their child poverty over time. But not necessarily the relative poverty. The picture is more mixed in that sense, what happened with the relative poverty. So what is our hunch or expectation with the child concentration, increasing children's concentration and child poverty? If I pause a second here, the obvious thing is, well, if the children are being born to the rich households, I would expect the child poverty to be much, much less because children are not anymore being present in the low-income households, right? But what about relative poverty? Or what about income inequality? So we did a bunch of simulations here. First, we wanted to look at the Gini coefficient as it stands in a stylized way with the concentration indices. It didn't come intuitively for us. We said okay, so the Gini coefficient and concentration are negatively correlated across the countries, 0.6. So the children are more likely to be concentrated in countries such as Finland, Denmark, and Sweden, but those countries are still more equal than the other countries, as we know. Although we might be estimating their equality more, misestimating their inequality more. And same goes for poverty. The negative correlation is there. Again, mind that we might be there's a very mechanistic explanation. In these countries, Scandinavian countries on the side, we don't see any more children that are in the low parts of the income distribution in the presence, and children under 3.2 when we replicate this study. So the decline in the poverty rate is somewhat mechanistic in these countries. And the child poverty, same here. So the lower income inequality can be happening both because children are not present in the poor households, but also because the equalization has made us underestimate the poverty in these countries. And then there are other key questions that are they related to the rise of cost of children? One may ask, say, okay, so you're talking about the Scandinavian countries, but is it more costly to raise a child in Scandinavia than, say, for example, Portugal or Spain, where the concentration is not as dramatic? I will show later on in the slides that we actually underestimate the cost of children in countries like Portugal and Spain and overestimate the cost of children in countries like Scandinavia. And so that in a way that inequality poverty figures are distorted. And one can also say that can it be preferences for children or interactions of the both? At the moment, our graphs show the interactions. We can't really sort out whether it's a preferences or a constraint, because a fertility scholar in me would tell, if the poor people, low-income households, are unable to have children, what the Gustafsson Anderson would call that there's an unmet need for welfare states to intervene in these settings. Low-income households are unable to fulfill their family size ideals, or it may be entirely preferences, because we are in a new era since 2010 for most of the advanced economies. The preferences might have changed towards having children, and the requirements for having children might be very different across different parts of the income distribution among the households. And these could diminish and reinforce the direct link between concentration and inequality. So what we do for that is we do some counterfactual simulations to capture the interaction in both dimensions, quite descriptively, quite simple simulations. So what we ask is basically following the previous literature that looks at the variance decomposition, and instead of using variance decomposition, use a new technique to look at whether inequality and poverty change when children's concentration changes, all other things kept constant. So the previous studies, when they want to look at, such as Bruce Western, Deidre Bloom papers, when they want to look at the inequality in the US, whether it's driven by the households with children and without children, they typically use variance decompositions. And however, the outcome is still income. They look at the variance of income, and they look at the predictions. And these things, we didn't feel comfortable with them, because variance is not an inequality measure itself. It's just a measure of a spread. There's no normative judgment about inequality. And these studies also use some sort of predictions out of a regression. And we do think that by nature, the predicted values are always going to be more compressed, and they're not going to show us the true inequality exists in the society. So there's this new literature, which Raphael would be much better equipped to explain you this new literature, but I'll do my best, talks about the recentered influence functions. These are some sort of functions that allows you to use Gini and poverty, these composite indices, as dependent variables, and you can actually look at the predicted counterfactuals using these direct measures of inequality rather than proxy measures of inequality. So we propose two exercises, both inequality and poverty. We look at cross-section all countries, looking at the latest year, and then we look at the time series across countries. For anyone who's interested in technicality, I'm happy to walk you through, but I'm going to skip here. This is kind of a conditional variance function that is recentered, and we estimate on a typical regression that you do. A RIF is a distributional statistics. It can be mean variance quantile or Gini or poverty indices. And we can look at the unconditional quantiles. And Frank Cowell has a study that looks at the list of influence functions for inequality indices and has developed some of these mathematics behind these indices. So the counterfactual recentered influence functions is working in this way in our estimates. We look at an inequality or poverty index as a function of quantity and the number of children. Sorry, income quartile and the number of children. And we estimate for each income quintile what the number of children is, and then we see how much that affects overall Gini coefficient or the poverty index that we use for the dependent variable. And then we predict out the counterfactual simulation, what would the country would look like if they had the factor income distribution where the children are zero, where the children are considered as adults, or where the children are somewhere in between. And three counterfactuals, we look at assuming if a country experience where all children are born in the bottom part of the income distribution. Think about a very low income country. In my head, Zimbabwe would fit this picture, for example, from Africa, where majority of the children for a good period of the 1990s have been born in the low income households. And it has changed now since. And then middle income quintile would be much of the Central European countries, or the top income quintile would be similar to what Sweden, Netherlands, or Germany has experienced. And we kind of looked at the data set, and then we said, well, counterfactual share of households with children should be 20%, because that is actually something we observe in data in Sweden, in Netherlands, or Germany. And we want to fix the average number of children, but it doesn't change. And it only changed the position of the children in the income distribution. Here is the graph. So when we look at the inequality across cross-sections, on the x-axis, I have countries and the most recent year available in the list data. There's a dramatic difference in inequality. Gini coefficient on the y-axis shows us income inequality in these countries. And the diamond shape shows if all children had been born in these countries on the top 20% of the income distribution, what would have happened to their Gini coefficient? And the blue square shows what if all children in this country had been born in the bottom part of the income distribution, bottom 20% of the income distribution, what would have happened to their Gini coefficient? Triangles would show what if all children born to the middle class, middle income group. And the black dot shows actual Gini is in the official statistics in these countries. So we can compare them. So in many countries, children being born on the very bottom is not good for inequality. Like children being present in the bottom of the income distribution shows that the inequality is like higher for those countries. But also children being born on the very top of the income distribution, inequality becomes much higher. And because we took Germany, Sweden, and Netherlands as a benchmark for 20%, what we show that here, some of those countries, if they had the distribution of Germany, Sweden, or Netherlands in terms of where children are born, their Gini coefficients would be much higher than their actual Gini coefficients. And that's an interesting point to make because a lot of the times that we show those countries as some of the goalposts for the countries' welfare state distributions and family structures and so on. I'm not saying anything causal here. So we don't know what actually positions of whether the welfare states are endogenous to the fertility distribution or income inequality distribution. But at the moment, as the final outcome of these country distributions are, those distributions would lead to inequalities much higher in other countries if we had followed their pathways in terms of concentration of children. And here is the US counterfactual simulation, the same. So the top trend, the blue line, would be if all the children in the US had been born in the bottom part of the income distribution, and the inequality would be far higher than already it is in the US. And if, like the black line shows the currently observed Gini in the official statistics for the US, and the like diamond shape, the yellow line, shows if the children are born on the top part of the income distribution, which is exactly mimicking if the US had the Swedish concentration of children, what the US trends would look like. And I could tell from 2000, and so 1995 onwards, US would show even a higher inequality if the US had followed the Swedish concentration distribution, this concentration of children, if the Swedish distribution was applied to the US case. So for the poverty, we see similar trends, but the trends are a bit more mixed. So allocating children to the bottom, to the middle, to the top, changes the poverty distribution, but children not being born, like all children not being concentrated on the bottom, apparently is a good thing for the overall poverty, which is as expected, and based on the headcount ratio. But in almost all these other distributions, where the children being on the top, or children being all concentrated only in the middle, will lead to poverty that is less than what it is now we observed in these countries. So this is again reinforcing the idea that in much of the countries where we see low poverty, children are already concentrated on the high part of the distribution. Part of it might be driven because of that location. So we do the same simulation for the poverty rate and the US official poverty rates, but we use the headcount ratio figure, not the US figures. And what we see is that these simulations, when children are born in the middle and the top, mostly that concentration trend had an effect on reducing the poverty rate in these countries. So our preliminary conclusions, there's a lot more work to do, that we want to expand this analysis to multiple directions, is that the effect sizes are like substantive. It varies between 10 to 18% of Gini solely due to the location of children in income distribution when we look at these extremes. But when I call them extremes, I actually look at the data and then pick up the countries where these extremes are actually lived, not coming out of a hypothetical distribution. And where children are born on the market income distribution has a secular and independent effect on inequality poverty that people haven't really discussed much. And I think it's further ado because in the last 15 years, the income differentials literature has stopped from the demographer side because fertility is already very low. And the focus has been only given to the childless people, whether they are poor, whether they are rich. but the discussion hasn't been shifted on, okay, not only the childless, but the high number of children, where are they concentrated in distribution? And an increasing concentration suggests a welfare gap if children are becoming unattainable to the poor or lower part of the household income distribution. And there's also a follow-up that Rafael and I are working on it, looking at the redistribution and tax simulations and transfers. So a lot of family benefits and tax allowances, once we take into account transfer to the families with children, the concentration and the children's presence on the income distribution becomes even further and more unequal. The concentration becomes even further top. In one measure, I think we found in Finland, it becomes like about 70% of the children concentrated between the 60 percentile to 19 percentile of the income distribution. So that's a large chunk of children are only on the upper part of the household income distribution. That calls into question, is it fair from the family policy's point of view or the tax policy's point of view? So I finish right here, and I'm happy to answer questions, and I have more slides if need be. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Berkay.